The Arizona sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the dusty main street of Redemption. Heat shimmered in waves above the baked earth, distorting the shapes of the saloon, the general store, and the blacksmith's forge, where the rhythmic clang of steel on steel was the town's weary heartbeat. For Clara Mee, the heat was just another challenge to be endured. She stood at the edge of the public corral, her knuckles white as she gripped the rough-hewn wooden fence. Inside, a dozen horses swished their tails, indifferent to the oppressive glare. Her focus was on a single mare, a dun-colored horse with a calm disposition named Juniper. To the seasoned cowboys who leaned against the nearby water trough, Juniper was little more than a reliable pack animal. To Clara, she was a mountain to be conquered. This would be the day. It had to be. Still staring at that horse, Clara? A voice drawled, thick with condescension. She didn't need to turn to know it was Deputy Hank, his lanky frame propped against a post, a smug grin plastered on his face. Beside him, Deputy Jeb, a stout man with a perpetual scowl, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. They were Sheriff Barlow's men, and they wore their authority like ill-fitting coats, too big for them and smelling of stale whiskey. "Just admiring," Clara replied, her voice tight. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. "Admiring's all you're good for," Jeb grunted. "Saw your last attempt. You slid off that saddle like butter off a hot skillet." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel. It pricked at her skin, but she held her ground. Her father, a man whose quiet strength was forged in the same fire as his horseshoes, had always told her that the loudest voices often held the least worth. She squared her shoulders, unlatched the corral gate, and walked in. The dust puffed up around her worn boots. Juniper turned her head, her large brown eyes watching Clara's approach with mild curiosity. Clara spoke to the mare in a low, soothing voice, her hand outstretched. She had spent weeks earning this small measure of trust, offering apples and brushing Juniper's coat until it shone. The physical act of riding was the only barrier left. With a deep breath, she grabbed the saddle horn and placed her left foot in the stirrup. The leather was hot to the touch. She pushed off the ground, a clumsy, uncoordinated movement that felt more like a lurch than a swing. For a fleeting second, she was up, her leg halfway over the saddle. A wave of triumph washed over her. But it was premature. Her balance was off, her weight shifted too far back. Juniper, startled by the awkward jolt, took a single, surprised step to the side. It was all it took. Clara's precarious hold vanished. She tumbled backward, landing in a heap in the thick, powdery dust. The world was a muffled thud and a cloud of red-brown dirt that filled her nose and mouth. The first sound to cut through the haze was the deputy's booming laughter. "Told you," Hank cackled, slapping his thigh. "Some folks just ain't made for the saddle." Clara pushed herself up, her face burning with a shame far hotter than the sun. As she brushed the dirt from her clothes, trying to salvage a shred of dignity, their voices lowered. They thought her too consumed by her own failure to listen. "The shipment arrives from Tucson at moonrise Thursday," Hank muttered to Jeb, his tone suddenly serious. "Barlow wants us at Coyote Pass. No witnesses this time. The last one talked too much before he got clumsy." Jeb nodded, his eyes scanning the street. "What about the payment?" "Half now, half when the cargo is delivered to the mining company. Barlow handles it all. We just make sure the road stays clear and quiet." The words were fragments, but they hung in the air with a sinister weight. No witnesses. Talk too much. A chill ran down Clara's spine despite the heat. She looked up, her gaze meeting Jeb's for a fraction of a second. His eyes narrowed with suspicion before he turned away, nudging Hank to silence him. The moment passed, but it left an ugly stain. Slowly, Clara got to her feet. The laughter had stopped, but the memory of it, and the dark promise of their whispered words, fueled a new fire within her. Her fall was no longer just a personal failure. It felt like part of a larger, dirtier world she had just glimpsed. She walked over to Juniper, who stood patiently and picked up the reins. Her hands didn't tremble. They were steady with resolve. She would get back on. Not just for herself, but for a reason she was only beginning to understand. The shame of the first fall clung to Clara, me like the fine red dust that coated everything in redemption. For 3 days, she avoided the center of town, the burn of humiliation still hot on her cheeks, but the memory of Hank and Jeb's sneering faces, and more importantly, their hushed, venomous words was a spur digging into her resolve. On the 4th morning, with the sun just beginning to bleach the color from the eastern sky, she was back at the corral. Juniper watched her approach with placid, intelligent eyes. "Morning, Clara." The voice, deep and raspy from years of coal dust and dry air, came from the shadows of the smithy. Her father, Elias, stood there, a heavy leather apron tied around his waist. He was a man forged from the same iron he worked, solid, quiet, and possessed of a strength that ran deeper than his corded arms. He wiped a hand across his brow, leaving a smudge of soot. "Thought you might be back." "Can't learn if I stay away," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. She ran a hand along Juniper's powerful neck, the horse nickering softly in response. Elias didn't say, "Be careful." He didn't need to. His concern was etched into the lines around his eyes as he watched her check the saddle cinch. "Horse isn't a machine, Clara. It's not about forcing it to bend to your will. It's a conversation. You have to listen to what she's telling you." He gave a short, sharp nod and returned to the rhythmic clang of his hammer, a sound that was both the town's heartbeat and the soundtrack of her childhood. Taking a deep breath, Clara swung herself into the saddle. This time felt different. There was no audience, only the vast, silent desert and her father's steady hammering in the background. She focused on his words, a conversation. She loosened her death grip on the reins, letting her body move with the horse's gentle sway. One step, then another. They made a slow, clumsy circle around the corral. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips. She was doing it. Perhaps it was the surge of confidence, or perhaps it was a spark that flew from the forge, but Juniper suddenly sidestepped, a nervous shudder running through her frame. Clara, startled, reacted instinctively, pulling back hard on the reins. It was the exact wrong thing to do. The horse, feeling the harsh command and panicked pressure, reared slightly. It wasn't malicious, just frightened, but it was enough. Clara lost her balance, her brief moment of triumph dissolving as she tumbled sideways, landing in the soft dirt with a grunt. The fall was less spectacular, less public, but it hurt her pride just as much. "Well, looky here, Jeb." A familiar drawl cut through the morning air. Hank and Jeb were leaning against the corral fence, materializing like buzzards drawn to decay. The little sparrow tried to fly again. Jeb chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "Seems she's better at plowin' the dirt with her face. Leave the riding to men, Clara me." She ignored them, pushing herself up and brushing the dust from her denims, her jaw set in a hard line. Their mockery was fuel. As she led Juniper back to the water trough, she watched them amble away, their path taking them toward Coyote Pass, the main freight route out of town. "The shipment," their words echoed in her mind. Later that afternoon, her body aching, Clara needed to walk. She followed the same path the deputies had taken, the trail winding up into the low-slung hills that overlooked the town. The air was still and hot, thick with the scent of creosote and dry earth. She was thinking about her father's words, about listening, when a glint of something unnatural caught her eye, tucked away in a dense patch of mesquite. Pushing aside the thorny branches, she found it, a splintered piece of a wooden crate. It must have fallen from a wagon taking the pass too quickly. But it wasn't the splintered wood that made her breath catch. Burned into its surface was a strange symbol, a serpent coiled around a pickaxe. It wasn't the emblem of the Redemption Mining Company, nor any of the freight lines she knew. It felt foreign, secret, illicit. Clara stared at the brand, the wood course beneath her fingertips. The secret shipment, the silencing of a witness. The deputies heading this exact way. It all clicked into place, not as a vague suspicion, but as a cold, terrifying certainty. Hank and Jeb were tangled in something far more dangerous than she had imagined. Holding the wooden shard, with the sun setting and casting long, ominous shadows across the pass, Clara Mee knew her quest was no longer just about mastering a horse. It was about survival. The air was still and cool, tinged with the scent of creosote and damp earth. Long before the first rooster crowed, Clara slipped out of the house and made her way to the corral. The moon, a silver sliver, offered just enough light to see Juniper's silhouette, a dark, patient shape against the pre-dawn sky. There were no eyes on her now, no jeering deputies or pitying townsfolk. There was only the horse, the dust, and the quiet resolve that had settled in her bones like stone. She remembered her father's words, not the instructions on how to hold the reins or where to place her feet, but the ones that mattered. Listen to her, Clara. She'll tell you what she needs. This time, she wouldn't try to conquer the animal. She would try to understand it. Clara approached slowly, speaking in a low, soothing murmur. She didn't just throw the saddle on. She ran her hand along Juniper's powerful back, feeling the muscles twitch and then relax under her touch. She felt the horse's warm breath on her neck as she tightened the cinch, a quiet exchange of trust. When she swung her leg over the saddle, the motion was fluid, not forced. She settled into the leather and took a deep breath, feeling the life beneath her, a steady, rhythmic pulse. She didn't kick or yank. She simply shifted her weight, a gentle squeeze with her knees, a soft click of her tongue. Juniper responded, taking a hesitant step forward, then another. They walked the perimeter of the corral, a slow, deliberate pace. Clara focused on the sway of the horse's hips, the rise and fall of its shoulders. She let her body move with the animal, becoming an extension of its rhythm. After a few laps, she urged Juniper into a trot. The gait was jarring for a moment, but instead of fighting it, she relaxed, found the cadence, and rose and fell in sync. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips. It wasn't a gallop across the plains, but it was a victory. It was control. It was freedom. Later that morning, the blacksmith's forge rang with the familiar clamor of hammer on steel. Elias worked, his face slick with sweat, shaping a glowing horseshoe. Clara lingered, a piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper in her hand. She'd spent an hour replicating the symbol from the broken crate. "Pa," she began, her voice barely audible over the hiss of hot metal meeting water. He glanced up, wiping his brow with the back of a calloused hand. "What is it, sweetheart?" She held out the drawing. "Have you ever seen a brand like this? It's not for cattle, I don't think." Elias took the paper, his brow furrowing as he studied the coiled serpent and pickaxe. "No, can't say I have. Ranch brands are simpler. Registered. This is different. The pickaxe may be a mining outfit, but there are no major mines that ship through redemption, not legally anyway." He looked at her, his expression sharpening with concern. "Where did you find this?" Before Clara could answer, the shadow of a large man filled the doorway. "Mornin', Elias. Got a loose shoe needs seein' too." Deputy Jeb sauntered in, his spurs clinking on the hard-packed dirt floor. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. She snatched the drawing back, crumpling it in her fist behind her back. Jeb's gaze flickered to her, a lazy smirk on his face. "Well, look who it is. Practicin' your drowin', little lady? Maybe you ought to stick to that. Safer than horses." Clara's face burned, but she held his gaze, her jaw tight. "Just helping Pa," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Elias stepped between them, his presence a solid wall. "The shoe, Jeb?" he asked, his tone flat and all business. Jeb grunted, turning his attention to his horse. But as Elias worked, the deputy idly glanced around the smithy. "Been busy lately," he remarked to no one in particular. "Lots of heavy freight coming through, special shipments. Keeps a man on his toes." His words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Clara felt a chill crawl up her spine. He didn't know what she'd found, but his casual remark was a warning just the same. When he finally let his horse out, Clara and Elias exchanged a look. The silent, shared fear confirmed it all. Her private mission had just become dangerously public. The encounter with Jeb left a chill in the forge that the fire couldn't burn away. Every clang of Elias' hammer on the anvil sounded like a warning bell. Clara knew she couldn't ask questions in town. Redemption's dusty streets had eyes and ears, and they all reported back to the sheriff's office. The freight station on the edge of town was her only option. It was the heart through which all goods, legitimate or otherwise, were pumped. To get there unnoticed, she'd need the one ally she could trust completely: Juniper. She waited until the moon was a pale sliver hanging in the inky sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the desert floor. The town was asleep, save for the distant, mournful howl of a coyote. Saddling Juniper in the quiet of the corral, Clara's movements were deliberate and soft. She whispered to the mare, her breath misting in the cool night air, "Just a quiet ride, girl. We need to be ghosts tonight." Juniper responded with a low nicker, a soft puff of warm air against her cheek, as if she understood the gravity of their task. The ride to the freight station was a masterclass in tension. Clara kept Juniper to the softest parts of the trail, the horse's hooves making little more than muffled thuds. The familiar path felt alien and menacing in the darkness. Every rustle in the sagebrush, every skittering lizard, sent a jolt of fear through her. This wasn't a ride for freedom or practice. This was a calculated risk, a foray into enemy territory. She was no longer a girl learning to ride. She was an infiltrator, and her survival depended on the bond she had forged with the animal beneath her. She tethered Juniper in a dense thicket of mesquite, a safe distance from the station, the building a long, dark silhouette against the horizon. A single lamp glowed weakly in the office window. Moving on foot, Clara felt exposed, her boots sinking into the fine dust. The main office door was locked, as expected. She crept along the building's perimeter, her fingers tracing the rough-hewn planks, until she found a window that was slightly ajar, left open to catch the faint night breeze. With a surge of adrenaline, she hoisted herself up and slipped inside, landing silently on the worn floorboards. The office smelled of stale tobacco and paper. A large ledger lay open on the clerk's desk. In the faint moonlight, her eyes scanned the pages of spidery script. Shipments of flour, barrels of nails, bolts of cotton. Mundane. Then she saw it. Tucked among the legitimate entries was a separate manifest, its handwriting more severe. Weekly shipments of specialized mining equipment and chemical reagents. Consigned to a Blackstone Mining Co., the destination was a remote outpost north of Coyote Pass. The name Blackstone was as foreign as the symbol on the crate. Suddenly, the crunch of boots on the gravel outside sent a spike of pure ice through her veins. She didn't have time to think, only to react, diving behind the heavy oak desk just as the door handle rattled. The voices were sharp and unmistakable. "I'm tellin' you, Hank, she's gettin' too curious," Jeb's voice snarled. "I saw it in her eyes at the smithy. She knows something." "She's a girl playin' with horses," Hank grumbled, his tone dismissive. "What could she know?" "She's Elia's daughter," Jeb countered, his voice low and dangerous. "That means she's stubborn. And smart. We need to check the manifest, make sure Silas is keeping things quiet." Clara held her breath, pressing herself against the floor, convinced the frantic hammering of her heart would give her away. The door creaked open. She heard them moving around the small office, the scrape of a chair, the rustle of paper. Jeb was too close. She could smell the cheap whiskey on his breath. "Manifest looks clean," Hank said after a moment. "Nothing out of place. Let's go. This place gives me the creeps at night." "Fine," Jeb relented, "but keep an eye on her. If she so much as looks at Coyote Pass again, I want to know." Their footsteps receded. The door clicked shut. Clara waited, her body rigid with terror, until the silence stretched and became absolute. Scrambling back out the window, she ran to Juniper, untying the reins with trembling hands. The ride back was a blur, a desperate flight under the uncaring moon. She had the name, Blackstone Mining Co., but she also had confirmation of a far more terrifying truth. She wasn't just investigating a crime anymore. She was being hunted. The sliver of moon offered little comfort as Clara slipped out of the house, the freight manifest clutched in her hand like a holy text. The words Hank had spoken echoed in her mind, a cold promise of violence. She's seen too much. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, sounded like approaching footsteps. Redemption was no longer a home, it was a cage, and the bars were closing in. There was only one path forward. A dangerous, dusty trail leading north of Coyote Pass to the so-called Blackstone Mining Co., She moved with purpose in the pre-dawn chill, preparing not for a simple ride, but for a campaign. From the kitchen, she took a full canteen of water and wrapped a piece of leftover cornbread in a cloth. In her father's smithy, the familiar scent of coal and iron was a fleeting comfort. She bypassed the hammers and tongs, her eyes landing on a small, sharp farrier's knife. Hesitantly, she tucked it into her belt. The cold steel against her hip was a grim reminder of the world she was riding into. When she led Juniper from the stable, the horse nickered softly, sensing the tension in her touch. "Easy, girl," Clara whispered, stroking her neck. "It's just us now." The journey was a testament to how far she'd come. The sun climbed, beating down on the Arizona landscape and turning the red rock to fire. Clara guided Juniper not with force, but with a quiet understanding, navigating treacherous stretches of loose scree and winding through canyons that would have terrified her weeks ago. The isolation was immense. The only sounds were the clip-clop of Juniper's hooves and the cry of a distant hawk. This wasn't just a ride, it was a pilgrimage into the heart of her fear. She was no longer the girl who fell, but a rider with a purpose as hard and unyielding as the land itself. By late afternoon, she reached the ridge overlooking the location marked on the manifest. Dismounting, she tethered Juniper behind a cluster of boulders and mesquite, giving her a reassuring pat. "Stay quiet," she murmured, before crawling on her belly to the edge of the overlook. What she saw below stole her breath. It wasn't a mine. There was no headframe, no slag heap, no sign of honest digging. It was a fortified camp, surrounded by a crude but effective stockade. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their rifles glinting in the sun. They moved with the cold efficiency of men who were paid to kill, not to mine. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was bigger and more violent than she had ever imagined. She watched as a heavy wagon, identical to the ones at the freight station, was backed up to a central building. Men began unloading long, narrow crates, the same kind she'd found a piece of near the pass. One of the crates slipped from a man's grasp and hit the ground with a heavy, metallic clang that was unmistakable. Rifles. Not picks, not shovels. They were smuggling guns. The Serpentine pickaxe brand suddenly made a sickening kind of sense. Deception and violence coiled together. Lost in the horrifying revelation, she didn't hear the scuff of a boot on gravel behind her. A shadow fell over her. Her blood ran cold. She rolled onto her back, fumbling for the farrier's knife as a guard stood silhouetted against the sky, not 10 feet away. He hadn't seen her yet. He was scanning the valley below. Juniper, bless her loyal heart, remained silent in the thicket. Clara held her breath, her knuckles white around the handle of the knife. The guard grunted, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dust, and turned, his boots crunching on the rock as he continued his patrol down the ridge. The sound faded, leaving only the frantic drumming of her own heart. She waited until she was sure he was gone, then scrambled back to Juniper, her body trembling with adrenaline. Mounting up, she didn't look back. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of blood orange as she rode away. The true, deadly nature of the Blackstone mining now burned into her mind. The ride back to redemption was a frantic, whispered prayer against the darkness. The moon, a sliver of bone white against an ink-black sky, offered little comfort, serving only to cast long, distorted shadows that danced like phantoms at the edge of Clara's vision. Every rustle of a creosote bush, every skittering of a rock displaced by Juniper's hooves, sent a spike of pure adrenaline through her. The thrill of mastering the treacherous path to the outpost was gone, replaced by the cold, metallic taste of fear. Hank and Jeb were no longer just town bullies. They were members of a private army, men who dealt in rifles and silenced witnesses. And she was their next witness. She didn't dare take the main road. Instead, she guided Juniper through the winding, forgotten cattle trails that snaked through the low mesas west of town. It was a longer, more difficult route, but it kept her in the shadows. Her mind raced, replaying the scene at the fort. The long, dark crates, the glint of steel, the cold efficiency of the guards. This wasn't just about smuggling a few guns. The sheer volume of weapons suggested something far more sinister. An uprising, a private war. The Blackstone Mining Co. was a lie, a carefully constructed facade to arm a force right under the sheriff's nose, or more likely, with his blessing. Reaching the outskirts of Redemption, she dismounted, her legs stiff and trembling. The familiar lights of the town, usually a welcoming sight, now seemed like 100 watching eyes. She couldn't take Juniper back to her father's livery. It would be the first place they'd look. She led the weary horse to a small, secluded arroyo where a trickle of water still ran, hidden by a thicket of salt cedars. She removed the saddle, murmuring her thanks to the animal and stroking its warm neck. "Stay hidden, girl," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'll be back for you." Clara crept through the back alleys of Redemption, a ghost in her own town. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the distant, tinny sound of a piano from the saloon. She saw Deputy Jebb's lumbering silhouette cross the main street, his shadow stretching unnaturally long under a gas lamp. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she pressed herself deeper into the darkness between the general store and the assay office, holding her breath until he was gone. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her father couldn't help, telling him would be signing his death warrant. The sheriff was a part of it. The whole town's authority was a rotten plank. Safely inside her small room, the weight of her knowledge pressed down on her, suffocating. She sat on the edge of her bed, the rough wool of her blanket a poor comfort. Who could she turn to? The question echoed in the silent room. Then an image surfaced from her memory. A man sitting on the porch of a small, well-kept cabin at the very edge of town, cleaning a Colt Peacemaker with meticulous care. Silas Blackwood. He'd been a U.S. Marshal for 20 years before retiring to Redemption, seeking peace. He was quiet, spoke little, and kept to himself, but her father had always spoken of him with a deep, unshakable respect. "Silas Blackwood," he'd once said, "is a man whose word is carved from granite." He was her only chance. It was a wild gamble. He could dismiss her as a hysterical girl, or worse, he could be part of the conspiracy himself, his retirement a lie. But inaction was a certain death sentence. She had to trust someone, and the memory of Silas's steady gaze and the quiet dignity he carried was the only anchor she had in this storm. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Clara stood up. Her resolve hardened, chasing the fear into the corners of her mind. She slipped out of the house as silently as she'd entered, her path now clear. She moved through the sleeping town, her destination the small cabin on the edge of everything. The porch light was off, the house dark, but she knew he was in there. A man like Silas Blackwood didn't truly sleep. She walked up the 3 wooden steps, her boots making no sound on the dusty planks. Her hand trembled as she raised it to the solid oak door. She hesitated for only a second, then knocked, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the midnight quiet. The old lawman opened the door a crack, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Silas Blackwood was leaner than in the wanted posters Clara had seen, his face a roadmap of hard-won battles. A Colt Peacemaker rested casually in his hand. "Whatever it is, it can wait till morning," he grumbled, his voice like stones grinding together. "It can't," Clara gasped, pushing a crumpled shipping manifest through the gap. "Blackstone Mining. Sheriff Culpepper is in on it. They're moving rifles, not ore. The last shipment is tonight." Silas's eyes flickered down to the paper, then back to her face, assessing the genuine terror and resolve etched there. He saw the dust on her clothes, the exhaustion, but also a fire he hadn't seen in years. He'd heard whispers, dismissed them as saloon talk. But this girl, the one everyone called clumsy, stood before him with the hard evidence he'd been too tired to look for. He slowly opened the door. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice now stripped of its weariness, replaced by cold, sharp steel. An hour later, a plan was set. It was desperate, risky, and relied entirely on Clara's courage and the bond she'd forged with Juniper. There would be no direct confrontation. Their only weapon was the truth, and their only stage was the town of Redemption itself. Just before midnight, the heavy rumble of a wagon pulling away from the sheriff's office echoed in the silent town. Clara, hidden with Juniper in the alley behind the livery, felt her heart pound against her ribs. Silas was positioned at the far end of Main Street, a double-barreled shotgun resting in the shadows beside him. It was all on her now. She watched as Sheriff Culpepper, along with Hank and Jeb, rode escort for the wagon, their figures silhouetted against the pale moonlight. They were heading for the quiet East Road, out of town. Clara took a deep, steadying breath, patting Juniper's neck. "It's just another ride, girl, the most important one." She nudged Juniper forward, kicking up a cloud of dust as she burst from the alley and galloped straight toward the wagon, not away from it. The deputies yelled in surprise, fumbling for their guns. Clara swerved at the last second, her face a mask of determination, and veered left, heading directly down the center of Main Street. "It's the girl! Get her!" Culpepper roared, his voice laced with panic. The chase was on. Hoofbeats thundered on the packed earth, a frantic drumbeat in the dead of night. They expected her to flee into the desert, but she was leading them into the heart of the town they controlled. Lights began to flicker on in windows. The noise was waking redemption. Clara leaned low over Juniper's neck, the wind whipping at her hair. She wasn't just riding, she was flying. Every lesson, every fall, every bruise had led to this moment. She and the mare moved as one, a seamless union of muscle and will. Shots rang out, but they were wild, the deputies more focused on the chase than their aim. They were faster, but Clara was smarter. She expertly navigated around a water trough, forcing Jeb's horse to stumble. She cut sharply past the blacksmiths, using the tight corner to gain a few precious yards. As they reached the town square, Silas stepped from the shadows, firing his shotgun into the air. The blast was deafening. The lead horses of the posse reared in terror, throwing Hank to the ground. At the same moment, Clara pulled Juniper into a sharp, sliding halt, turning to face her pursuers. The sheriff's wagon, trying to avoid the chaos, swerved violently. A wheel hit a hitching post with a sickening crunch. The wagon tilted, and the large wooden crates slid off the back, crashing onto the street and bursting open. Under the glow of the newly lit lanterns from the saloon and hotel, dozens of brand new rifles spilled across the dirt. The conspiracy was laid bare for all to see. Doors opened as townspeople, drawn by the commotion, flooded into the square. Their murmurs of confusion turned to gasps of shock and then to growls of anger. Sheriff Culpepper, Hank, and Jeb were trapped, surrounded by the guns they were smuggling and the citizens they had betrayed. Silas Blackwood walked forward, leveling his shotgun. "It's over, Culpepper." The sheriff, his face pale with defeat, slowly raised his hands. The girl he'd dismissed, the one his deputies had mocked, had outmaneuvered them all. Clara sat tall on Juniper, breathing heavily but no longer afraid. She had fallen 3 times, but tonight, under the Arizona moon, she had outridden the darkness and brought the dawn of justice to redemption.